Hello everyone, and thank you for listening to Off the Drawing Board, the official Sheffield University Architecture Society podcast. I am Daphne, and I want to welcome you to the third episode of the book discussions, where we invite students of the University of Sheffield School of Architecture and Landscape to talk about a particularly interesting book. Today, we have Dan Josephs joining us in the studio. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, thank you for having me. I've really wanted to do this for a while, so good to be here.
It's wonderful to hear that, and thank you for joining us in the studio. I am already really excited to discuss about today's book. But before we begin, I would like to invite you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your journey through architecture.
I would love to do that. Okay, so yeah, I'm Dan Joseph. It's funny actually, like when I was younger, I actually wanted to be an architect, and then I found landscape architecture through architecture. Basically, if you're like not getting A stars in maths, it's like, oh. So went to landscape. That was really cool. I've done my 3 years undergrad in landscape architecture. Then I went and did my placement year last year at a place called Camlins in Shrewsbury. Really nice place. Learned so much, but not just about like landscape, but more like about like the urban side as well, designing in cities and stuff like that. And that really that took such an interest in that. So now I've come back doing my masters, and then who knows what the future holds. Yeah.
It is amazingly exciting to have a landscape architecture student in the studio. And I find it fascinating that we have this interdepartmental connection within Sheffield, and everything is linked. And that's why the school changed the name to the Sheffield School of Architecture and Landscape too. So it's wonderful to have you here, Dan. Thank you again for joining us. So today we will be talking about how to think about cities. This is a book that was published not too long ago. It's fairly recent. It was published in late 2022. And the book is by Deborah James and Joseph Pearce. The publishing house is Polity. And I think it would be wonderful, Dan, if you can introduce us to this book. What is this book about?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting book. It's quite a complex one. But cities now in our modern society, they're getting more and more complex. And as designers, we need to like learn how to design these cities for people. So this book kind of introduces us. Yeah, I say introduces because it doesn't go into full details at the start, but it introduces us to how to think about designing our cities and how each city has its own unique language, and that has to come across in how we're designing it. So that's a brief introduction to what it talks about, yeah.
I don't know if you've read any of the Hunchback of the Notre Dame, but Victor Hugo in that book has a chapter that is called This Will Kill That. So this chapter is separated in two parts, I would say. The first part is talking about the relationship of the book and the architecture, and the second part talks about how the architecture is killed by the book. So the first part kind of correlates architecture to how a book is structured. So we've got bricks that are letters, and then you put them together, and you get words, which are buildings, and then the city is like the whole book of how you experience it. Wow. So it sounds like a pretty similar correlation to how to think about cities, like reading a book, isn't it?
So intelligent, very intelligent.
This book already sounds like it's got a very multidisciplinary structure. And I would like to ask you, why did you choose to talk about it? What did you think was particularly interesting in the way that they do analyze cities?
To be honest, the reason I actually picked this book to read, this is just something I just wanted to read for my own understanding, because in this generation, nowadays, we are seeing cities are being developed and densified, right? A lot of new development is going into cities because nowadays everyone knows like cities are where most of people in our society live, right? So that's why this book is relevant to me for starters. If people are going to be in our cities, we need to learn how to like develop them, right? And the way this book kind of talks about it, it kind of rethinks how you can think about a city. It kind of restructures your thought process. Like it talks a lot about theories and perspectives from even different religions and different backgrounds. I find it really interesting and refreshing that you can think about a city in like so many different ways. So there's so many lenses to design from. And so if you've even got a glimpse of a few of them, then you're going to be much better of a designer. So that's why I picked this book, yeah.
Sometimes as architecture students, it is really easy, or not even just as architecture students, as architects, it's really easy to forget the urban analysis. Usually we dive into site analysis or specifics of the design. But It might have been Giorgio Grassi that said the building without the city is nothing, because without the context you can't really read a building, and if it doesn't have a place in the city you can't really do much about it.
That's so true.
Is there a particular lens you believe in the book that you thought was really exciting and like to discuss?
Yeah, actually. This is something that I just didn't really even think of before, but and it makes sense now, it does. But cities are places, right? So these are destinations that people are moving into, right? So if you're placemaking, you've got to think of certain factors. And I knew about economy. This book talks about a lot about that, how cities power our economy, right? You see London, that's where we make the most money, in London. And that powers our economy in the UK, right? But for this economic factor, there's also a political factor. Like, who are the main drivers in a city and what are their policies for that city? For example, you can see London to Sheffield, it has a very different feeling. You can see that, right? You know, London is more business centered. Sheffield is starting to progress that way, but it's slightly slower. It's a student city, right? And so this is kind of that political lens that I'm talking about. Like, what are the higher ups kind of wanting for that city, right? And again, there's this other book by Jan Gehl. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but Jan Gehl, he was a famous architect. He liked to look at how people use their cities and how people move through spaces. So his studies are all about people. And this book actually, it's kind of alluding to those ideas, but from a higher perspective. So for designing spaces for people, you've got to first think about what are the higher kind of agendas for that city. So, for example, I always use London as the big example, because London's such an economic centre of the UK, right? London, in terms, is so much more busy, right? And it's much more densified, because this is where people are contributing to the economy. So if they're going to contribute to the economy like this, what kind of spaces do people need? And this book kind of talks about a few of them. So, you know, you're going to need places of rest, right? You're going to need some pause spaces. And as a landscape architect, this is where we come in, different typologies. You can have gardens, you can have parks, you can even have plazas as places of rest. And then you need your transition nodes, right? So going from point A to point B. These are your main streets, you know. But I mean, as a landscape architect, how can you improve that? Well, you can add some greenery in, trees to provide shade and canopy for people. But then you also need places of privacy, which is something that is really, this book kind of alludes that we need more of this, in our cities. Places where people can be alone, which is hard to do in a city, because no one's ever going to be fully alone. But you need places of retreat almost. So yeah, those are a few of the concepts that was so interesting.
I think the last one particularly, with urbanization, it's so difficult to get a moment of peace within that massive cityscape, because everything is so hectic. And as you mentioned, London's a really good example, because due to the urbanization and the massive population attraction from different countries as well, you've got that repurposing of the city, which constantly shifts towards a more economical drive and a more big city capital vibe. So it is particularly interesting and challenging for the designer to think, how am I going to repurpose that? So even though it is oriented towards a more economical shift, I can still create places having this peaceful feeling to them and have a calm, slower rhythm.
Yeah, and it's that thing as well. That's exactly true. And what I don't see a lot in our cities nowadays, which is something that I'm really interested in, down the line, helping to improve this, is if we've identified somewhere as a main driver for economy. So if people are going to be working hard and working a lot of hours a day, maybe, 8-9 hours a day, does all of this work have to be indoors? Which is a debate. It kind of crosses disciplines, because this is not only just about designing or landscape or architecture, but it's also about social being, mental health, well-being. Do you always want to be indoors doing work, right? And if the answer is no, which I feel like with the climate getting hotter and hotter each year, people are going to want to be outdoors more and more each year. So if this is the case, we kind of need to start creating some outdoor workspaces. And again, that's an infrastructure that, we might start seeing in our cities in the future. Again, that kind of narrative is so different from London to, another city, Manchester. Again, it's coming up in that economic force, in that drive, but it's not as established as London, which has been there for a while. So again, they're going to have slightly different policies, and their roads seem a lot wider. It seems slightly slower, and then that's so different to Sheffield, which is for students. Sheffield is the greenest, or one of the greenest in the UK, and that's really fostering our well-being, right? And it's right next to the Peak District, so such different typologies, and that really dictates like what each city will look like. So yeah, it was so interesting.
You can say that there is a personification of each city and how you experience that city. So the same way that each person has a personality and specific attributes to their idiosyncrasy, you've got cities that have a similar structure and similar layout according to what they want to achieve. So a more economic oriented or an aspiring economic city like Manchester, and then you have Sheffield, a student oriented city, as you said, that focuses a bit more on the nature part, even though it was an industrial landmark in the past. So it is interesting to see how these develop in different ways.
Literally. One of the kind of who we kind of look to now as designers, for example, Copenhagen, it is the city to follow, really. So they've started moving away from having cities that are solely based on car movement, and they've started shifting to this cyclist pedestrianality kind of vibe. Over the past years, they've redeveloped their whole cycle pedestrian infrastructure into the point where cyclists and pedestrians are taking predominance over cars. I went there in summer last year just to observe. I literally just sat and people watched. I was just seeing what people are doing in the city. They are literally the biggest components of a city. And again, one of the concepts that this book talks about is people-centered like cities, right? We are making spaces for people. So I think as a designer, if you've always got that in your head, I don't think you're going wrong if you're focusing on them.
It's so easy to forget, and one of the biggest comments that we always get from the tutors is add people to your plans and sections. I think you've heard that before. It's so easy to forget.
It's so easy.
I don't think we realize how big of a mistake it is as designers to not incorporate people in our buildings or even the city, because the city is not built for anybody else apart from the people. It is person-centered principle from the beginning of the ancient polis, where the structure of the modern city is starting to appear, having the center, which is a fortified center, and then having the perix, which was everything that was going around, and having that sense of we need to protect the people and we need to have an independent, autonomous principle to protect us and structure us and give our society, the politia as it was called, a structure as well. So the city was kind of forming the constitution as well. It is really interesting to see how today this might not be the case, because we are more focused on just creating buildings and creating space without necessarily considering the parameters of that space.
That's so true. There's also that indoor-outdoor hybrid that is actually, I do believe the best spaces, the thing is with landscape architecture and architecture, they're so intertwined actually. And in fact, that's how it should be, because you're not just creating a building, but you have to also think about how that building inhabits a space, right? So that indoor-outdoor kind of blend, how people transition from inside to outside, or even how someone can be inside but feel like they're outside. That's something that I feel like architects are exploring more and more these days with.
I think I was very eager to ask you that as well, because you are a landscape architect. So you've got a very fresh perspective on how the balance between indoors and outdoors should be, as well as the incorporation of greenery and perhaps just differently structured spaces, so that we don't just have buildings. Buildings are just 2% of the Earth's surface.
Didn't even know that.
It is very little, isn't it? So what happens with the rest of the surface? What do you think helps or defines a city from the way that the outdoors is structured?
Even from that, like you can see our world is, most of it is water, right? The other percentage of that is land, and you said that 2% are buildings. So you can see our world, landscape, actually, it shouldn't be like a landscape first thing. No, it's not like that at all. But from how our world is structured, landscapes are the predominance, right? A space is a space, and you can put a building in a space, but the building doesn't become the space. The space is already there. As a landscape architect, we're kind of seeing ourselves become more and more important. in our corporate world in designing spaces, because I think people are recognizing the need to collaborate very closely with landscape architects, and the buildings become a part of this jigsaw puzzle really. But I feel like the best designers, they work in collaboration with these multidisciplinary teams. I actually watched this project, it's called The Local Project on YouTube. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's about architects designing homes in Australia or New Zealand, but they talk a lot about how the indoor and the outdoor are simultaneous. They're a blend and the two become one. Because you see, let's talk about myself. If I'm on holiday and I've rented an Airbnb, for example, the Airbnb is on the border of the beach, right? I could be living in the Airbnb, but the place I'm in is the beach, right? So the place is first and the place is the beach. The Airbnb is part of that identity. And so you can see there, if I'm going to have the best experience in that space, I want that Airbnb to kind of allow me to feel part of that place. And so through the way you use planting, if you can gather inspiration from a building, you can go into a building and you can see like what kind of furniture they're using in the building. Like, are they using timber, are they using oak? And then start to incorporate that in the landscape around the building. And you're forming a blend there between two spaces becoming one. So that's indoor, outdoor I'm kind of talking about. And actually now in Copenhagen as well, they're planting indoors now, which is so interesting. Like they're planting trees inside buildings now.
It is fantastic, and it's really pioneering in the sense that if we continue to do that, so you spoke about a very small example, for instance, an Airbnb on the seaside, but then if we start doing that with all of our buildings and we expand to the city scale, it will suddenly become a very different realm. And due to all the concerns that we've got right now with environmental issues, spatial issues, I think that might be a sort of solution, or at least an experimentation that should be discovered.
Certainly. There's another problem as well that's going on. You touched on it, but like because of how dense cities are getting, right? The demand for people living in cities is still growing, and so cities are getting denser and denser and denser. That means buildings are getting higher and higher and higher and higher. So if that's going to happen, sometimes that means that there's less space for green spaces, like on the ground layer, right? Because, you know, new buildings are taking that priority. So as a landscape architect, this is where like we really should be working a lot closer with architects. Like how can we bring green spaces into buildings? Or even if it's not in buildings, now they're starting to incorporate a load of green roofs, which is really good. But BNG, that happens a lot in London Biodiversity Net Gain. So they're starting to see different ways that we can reimagine how our greenscapes look in cities. Green walls and then green inside of buildings. These are all different kind of topics that, you know, they're going to start exploring more and more with.
Does that book as well introduce you to those concepts, or is it more following the already conventional way of looking at a city, you think?
So this book doesn't actually talk about those concepts. It introduces us to the policies, the theory, and then it uses different case studies as reference. It opens my mind. So from reading this, I just started researching like where's doing it great, right? And I think if you're really interested in, you know, like learning about how these spaces are designed, I never think one book's enough, really. I think this is just a basis, right? And again, like I've talked about a few things generally, but I always draw my connections from a multiple range of literature. So I found out this book talks a lot about people, which is something that Hangel talks about a lot. And then that people-centered focus, that will be another writer as well. So you can always draw from a range of sources.
I think that's the beauty of a book, that it will give you so much inspiration and open your mind in ways that you might not imagine. And perhaps if I read that book, I will get different ideas from you, but it doesn't really matter because the source of inspiration is what creates this diversity of ideas. And you actually touched on it, and I find it particularly interesting because you mentioned how the book mentions people. What I thought was amazingly fascinating, Dan, was that neither of the authors are architects or landscape architects. So Deborah Martin is a professor of geography and Joseph Pierce is a lecturer of human geography. So they're really diverse and they don't even come from a perspective of planners or architects or landscape architects. And they give you this very holistic view of what a city is. Isn't that amazing?
That's what I find spectacular. This is why I see such a need to draw from other kind of fields. I really hope like in the future we start to see a bigger blend in design fields. I know we work closely together, architects, landscape architects, urban designers, and you've got your city planners. But I genuinely think we can learn a lot from like the sociologists, geographers. These guys really know what it means to understand the person, right? And these guys really know what it means to understand the place, right? And we need to kind of draw from them, really. As you've said, these guys don't actually have experience in this field, yet they know so much about it and they bring such a unique view. To make everyone think the same way is actually doing a bit of damage to our cities. But again, like, you would read it and you'll have a completely different view for me. But I think that's what makes the best designers. And when you can all share what you all think about that, you can design incredible places.
There's a tendency to flatten out everything while we've got very similar ideas and we don't really divert from the already existing status quo. And introducing, as you said, different disciplines within the realm of designing a city will be particularly beneficial. So Dan, I've got one last question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think that the book gave you an answer on how to think about cities, or do you think that this is something that you still need to explore, or the book needs to explore?
That's a really good question, because one of the last pages was saying, it was talking about how complex our cities are. And he was saying, like, we will never actually get a full answer on how to design. There's no A or B formula, right? So no, it doesn't give you this is how you should do it. It gives you, this is what you should think about these certain factors. So I think a book like this gives a lot of interpretation to the reader. Like, this is some ideas we think. You go and explore this and see what you can come up with, which is what I think it's cultivating the next generation of designers, which I hope I can be a part of.
It is really good when a book gives you really good food for thought. I think that this is what you should get out of a book. You shouldn't get just answers. You should get more questions. The more questions you get, the more specific you can be with your answers.
That's so true.
So the easier the question, the harder the answer, they say. So how to think about cities might be a really easy thing to ask, but a really complex thing to answer.
Yeah.
And I think that reading that book might be especially beneficial for, as you said, the next generation of designers who will be in charge of facing a lot of challenges that perhaps were slowly created by the previous generations. But here we are, and we do need to find as close of an answer as we can.
Literally.
And on that note, that brings us to a very beautiful conclusion of today's episode. I think it's been a wonderful conversation, Dan, and would really like to thank you for bringing this book in with us.
It's a pleasure. Honestly, you don't know how much that means to me. I really enjoyed it. Really, really enjoyed it. Just to even express what I think about a book. I really appreciate it.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully our listeners will also be intrigued to approach architecture from a different, more holistic perspective when diving into this book. And remember, if you are a student of Sheffield School of Architecture and Landscape and have an interesting architecture book that particularly liked, you can also participate in our podcast. By contacting SSoAL in any of our social media, you can arrange a recording with us in the podcast studio and talk about what you found exciting. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.